Please note this podcast discusses real-life crimes and may include sensitive topics such as violence, abuse, and other disturbing content. We recommend listener discretion.
He would make unsolicited visits. He probably told them he was giving a vitamin boost injection or something, roll their sleeves up, have an injection, very quietly go to sleep, and that would be it. A surprising number took place actually in his own surgery. In one case, he left the dead body in one room while he continued to see patients in the other room. He was addicted to killing.
I'm journalist Helen Fospero.
I'm crime reporter Martin Brunt.
And this is True Criminals.
A journey into the darkest corners of the criminal underworld with insights from decades of true crime reporting.
The stories behind the stories, plus exclusive interviews with those closely involved in notorious cases.
Re-examining crimes so shocking they still haunt our imaginations.
True Criminals Insiders.
If you're following us on Patreon, thank you. And there'll be an exclusive extra chat about today's true criminal following the main episode. What if the person you trusted most with your health turned out to be a killer? In this two-part special, we're exploring the story of a respected pillar of the community, a doctor loved by his patients because he never seemed too busy to chat. Dr. Harold Shipman was one of the most prolific serial killers the world has ever known, murdering between 200 and 300 victims over some 30 years and eventually committing suicide.
Behind a veneer of trust and care, this family GP was secretly killing his patients. No case in British history has ever involved one person murdering so many. In this first episode, we'll explore how the doctor's deadly secret was finally revealed, from the initial suspicions and investigation to his dramatic trial and conviction. And in the next episode, we'll look at the legacy of the case, what happened to Shipman, and how the case changed medical practice in Britain.
And in both episodes, we'll be drawing on the expert insights of Jean Ritchie, co-author of the best-selling Prescription for Murder, the true story of Harold Shipman. Jean, welcome to True Criminals. It's great to have you with us.
Hello.
Jean, before we get into the story in detail, what was it that prompted you to write your book about Shipman?
I think my co-author and I became fascinated. He was a journalist working in Manchester, and at the time of the first suspicion that something was going on, there was very much a media feeling that it was euthanasia conducted by a doctor up north, and probably a kind doctor who was helping a few elderly patients on their way when their time was up. And I think it was the feeling quite strongly that this was not the case, that there was something much more sinister going on here. And that was what made it feel as though possibly there's something much more deep in this, something very interesting to explore and therefore to write a book about.
And of course, there was a lot more going on, fascinating stuff and lots for you to explore as an author. Start us off, Jean, by explaining who Harold Shipman was.
Harold Shipman, actually, he was known as Fred Shipman to everybody who knew him, because his name was actually Harold Frederick, but he'd always from childhood been called Fred. He was a young man born in Nottingham, aspirational, decided at some point, probably in the sixth form at school, that he wanted to be a doctor. He then went to Leeds Medical School, worked very hard, not particularly brilliant, but hard-working, everybody said that, qualified as a doctor, and eventually started working at Pontefract General Infirmary, where we now know he started killing people.
Jean, there was an important moment in his life. He was 17 when his mum died, but specifically, he was there at her bedside, and he was suddenly introduced to, I suppose, what you might call the comforting effect of morphine on her pain.
Yes, this was in the days before patients had syringe drivers and could administer their own morphine. So the family doctor used to come round twice a day and give her morphine, and she lived basically longing for that moment when the morphine came. There's a suspicion, we'd never be able to confirm it, that the doctor actually trusted him to administer morphine. We don't know. Those doctors are dead. But he certainly became very much enmeshed in the idea that morphine brought her relief. He was her pride and joy. He was one of 3 children. He was the bright one, the clever one, the one that went to grammar school, the one she thought the world of. And just at an age where most of us are beginning to question our parents' worldview, she died. So he always subscribed to her worldview, which was that he was amazing, marvellous, cleverer than everybody else. And somehow that became enmeshed in his whole personality. And also morphine came in there very strongly.
So on the outside, everything looked normal, but in 1975, just a few years into his practice, he hit a serious professional problem, didn't he? His own addiction. What was that all about?
He became addicted to pethidine, which is an analgesic, and it's very often used for women in pregnancy and childbirth. It's usually nurses who become addicted to it. They take it for menstrual pains, but he became addicted to it, and he was forging prescriptions and taking legitimate prescriptions from patients. And this was discovered, and he actually lost his job as a GP in the Yorkshire town of Todmorden, and he was sent away to rehab for a certain length of time. He was fined in court. He was found guilty. He was fined, and it was £600, which was quite a lot of money in those days. But he was not struck off by the GMC. He was still on the medical register. And of course, he was a very compliant, well-behaved patient at the rehab centre, which specialised in doctors and medical people. And so when he came out, he was able to start work again, not initially as a GP, but later as a GP.
It's interesting, isn't it, that he wasn't struck off the medical register. So when did he start being a GP again?
Today, he would be struck off the medical register. There's no doubt we are a lot tighter about things like that today. He worked for a very short time for a health authority in the northeast, which meant he didn't front up to patients at all. But then he very soon wanted to get back into practice, and he saw an advertisement for a GP practice in Hyde. So after less than 2 years out of the profession, he applied for it. He was honest at the interview. He told the other doctors that he'd had this problem, but it was cured, and he could reassure them that it was. And he got the job.
Seems extraordinary, doesn't it, that he was let off with just a warning and then got back into a full-time job. And when he did that, all the testimony that emerged later suggests he was genuinely well-liked as a GP in Hyde, which was a tight-knit community. He really did become popular with his patients, didn't he?
Yeah, I've always said that if he wasn't killing you, he was the best GP you could have. He would spend a lot of time with you. He would remember the names of your children and your grandchildren and your cats. He would always be prepared to give you expensive medicines if he thought they were the right things that you needed. So his patients thought the world of him. And when he actually split from being in part of a large group practice and set himself up independently, which is quite significant because with a group practice, other doctors can take note of what you're doing a bit. But when he set up independently, he had his own fiefdom. But there were people queuing. There was a 2-year waiting list to get onto his practice because he was so popular.
It's extraordinary, isn't it? It reminds me of growing up. Our GP used to give us honey from the bees in his garden, and going to a GP like that was a very different experience to perhaps it is today. So to actually think of him being so well liked, always time for a chat, remembering your children's name, paints an extraordinary picture of somebody who turned out to be very different to that. Jean, tell us, what was Shipman's method of murder and who did he target?
The main method, without doubt, over 250 deaths, and most of them were at home. He would visit patients at home, which wasn't quite so unusual in those days. It's quite unusual today, but in those days it was more common. But he would make unsolicited visits, or he would have seen somebody in his surgery in the morning and he'd turn up at her house in the afternoon. Generally, we don't know what he told them, but we think he probably told them he was giving a vitamin boost injection or something, roll their sleeves up, have an injection, very quietly go to sleep, and that would be it. Most of them took place in their own homes. A surprising number took place actually in his own surgery. It's very, very unusual for somebody to die in a doctor's surgery. Obviously, it has been known to happen, but it's very unusual. And he had about 5 or 6 deaths in his surgery, which is quite unusual. And again, he just gave people an injection. In one case, he left the dead body in one room while he continued to see patients in the other room. And he had episodes of killing. He was able at times to stop. Sometimes he stopped for nearly a year. Almost always when he had a bit of a scare, when there was maybe a nurse or somebody asking too many questions, and he backed off. So although he was an addictive personality, obviously with the pethidine addiction, he was also addicted to killing, but he was initially at least able to control it. It ran out of control towards the end.
And he was very good, Jean, at destroying evidence, wasn't he? Very simply, many of his victims were cremated, and he didn't seem to have any trouble signing the cremation forms, even though, in theory, there should have been a double signature, shouldn't there?
He tried very hard to persuade all the families of his victims to have the bodies cremated, because obviously that got rid of the evidence of the morphine in the body. And the very interesting thing is, if you are a doctor and you want to kill people, then morphine is the wrong choice. Morphine has been found in the body of 13th century mummies. It doesn't degrade in the body. Whereas something like insulin, you can kill people with insulin and it will be gone within a couple of days. So it was definitely a relationship with morphine, not simply with killing. He wanted everybody to be cremated. Obviously, the ones he was eventually charged with were the ones that were buried, where the families insisted on a burial. He wanted a cremation, and to do a cremation, you have to have 2 doctors sign. Now, when he was in single practice on his own, that meant he crossed the road to another doctor's surgery and got another doctor to sign. And in fact, one of the people who very much raised the alarm about him, well, 2 of the doctors from the other surgery, became very concerned that they were signing too many cremation certificates. And the undertakers became very concerned. There was always an excuse in that because he was very popular with old people, he had an older demographic among his patients. And therefore, naturally, you are going to have more deaths if you have old people. But there were plenty of people raising the alarm that there were too many deaths going on. But by that time, of course, we're up in the 200 and odd deaths.
You mentioned there, Jean, that it was morphine that he seemed to be obsessed with. Do you think that does go back to earlier in his life and his mum being ill? Is there a correlation there?
Yes, I think it absolutely goes back to his mum, because it would be very much easier to kill people successfully with insulin or potassium. They disappear. And so within 2 or 3 days, there would be no trace in the body and nobody would ever know you'd done it. Whereas, yes, he definitely had a relationship with morphine. Morphine was his drug of choice for killing, definitely.
It might have been more understandable that so many people were dying if they were terminally ill, but a lot of his patients weren't terminally ill, were they?
No. There were a few, particularly at the very beginning. They tended to be people whose lives he was hastening along when he was working in the hospital mainly. But no, later on they were certainly not expected to die. He was killing people who were fit, healthy and leading very active lives. There are plenty of examples of that among the people he killed.
So for 2 decades, nobody really suspected foul play for a very long time. But in the 90s, the death rate among Shipman's patients did finally start to raise some eyebrows in the local medical community. What happened, Jean?
There were various people. The home helps who used to go in and help elderly people all became a bit alarmed. There was a retired taxi driver who, well, he was semi-retired and he just did a little bit of driving of old ladies to the supermarket and the train station. And when he went home and said one of his regular customers had died, his wife would say, "Another Shipman?" And he started writing them down and he handed his list eventually to a policeman who was involved. The main alarm was raised by the doctor who was working in the practice across the road from his. And that started a first inquiry into him. And the great tragedy, and certainly for 4 more women, was that that inquiry was dismissed. It was found that he was just a doctor who had a lot of elderly patients. That police inquiry was a complete waste of time, and it allowed him to carry on a little bit.
It was put down to poor policing. They only looked at it for about a month, I think, and the police later admitted that they'd assigned junior officers to it who were really out of their depth looking into what was a very complex matter. It was a disaster, as it turned out, and he was effectively cleared, and then he went on killing.
He did. And it didn't take 3 or 4 more deaths before he was stopped completely. I say only 3 or 4 more, but that's tragic for those families. But yes, it was a complete mess up, that first investigation. The policeman was fobbed off with the usual stories. Oh, he's got lots of old people on his list. Old people die. So many people who sang his praises, talked about wonderful care they'd had from him. And that investigation was shelved, and he carried on.
So how did his downfall come, Jean?
Well, this is really, really interesting because he killed a lady called Kathleen Grundy. Her husband had been the mayor of Hyde. She was a very well-respected, very well-known person. She was 81, but she was so fit and well that when one person heard she died, the reaction of this woman was, oh, did she get knocked over when she jumped off the bus? Because she used to jump off the bus before her stop came. And he forged her will. And this was something he'd never done before. He had stolen from the people he killed, but only in a very mild pilfering sort of way. With Kathleen Grundy, he forged her will. He forged it very, very incompetently. A 12-year-old child could have done it better. He sent it to a solicitor where she had never been involved before, and yet she was well established in the town and did have a solicitor. And also, he knew perfectly well that her own daughter, Angela Woodruff, who he was cutting out of the will completely because he was leaving everything to him, was a solicitor. So there's a very strong feeling, and I think I subscribe to it, is that he wanted to be caught. He wanted to be stopped. We can talk about why. That's all terribly interesting. But I think he definitely wanted to be stopped, or he thought, if I get away with this quite large amount of money, she was one of the few amongst his victims who was relatively wealthy. And I think he thought, if I do get away with it, I'll just move to France with my family and that'll be it. And if I don't get away with it, well, I will be stopped. And how consciously he thought that, I think probably not, but subconsciously, he was running out of control. The addiction was definitely mastering him, and he wanted to be stopped in some way, either by getting away with the money or by being arrested, which is what happened.
So thank goodness for Angela Woodruff.
Yes.
This was now the second time that year that Shipman's name had been given to the police, and this time they were a bit more assiduous in their investigation.
Yeah, this time the police took it very seriously indeed. But it started off with a forgery of a will. Angela Woodruff traced the solicitor and the witnesses to the will and went to the police in the area where she lived and said, I think that this will has been forged. That was referred to the Greater Manchester Police, and then because of the previous inquiry into Shipman, they all took it very seriously that Shipman was a man that they needed to look at. And very, very quickly, they moved to exhuming the body of Kathleen Grundy. And it was the first exhumation, I think, by the police in many, many years. And then they went on to do another 14. So it was a completely unusual and strange, but massive investigation when it started.
Just reading, Jean, on some notes here that the forged will had been typed and the police discovered that Shipman owned an old Brother typewriter that matched the typeface used in the fake will. And that forgery definitely sounds like it was reckless and perhaps out of character for a man who had covered up his crimes so carefully for decades. You mentioned there that perhaps you thought he wanted to be caught. Why do you think he wanted to be caught, even if it was subconscious?
It's such a crude forgery. It was crude in its wording. It was crude in the typing. Kathleen Grundy was known to have been a very proficient typist. It was done on a typewriter that they ultimately found at the surgery, his premises. The two witnesses were conned into signing it, but then he forged their signatures, copied their signatures badly, copied Kathleen Grundy's signature badly. Her daughter Angela was able to just compare the signature with the real signature, and she went to the police and showed them, this is the signature she has when she pays in money for age concern that she worked for. This is the signature on this will. They're not the same person. So it was so badly done. And as you say, he was meticulous in his killings to avoid detection. Not that that was too difficult in his situation, but he was clever at doing that. So why did he suddenly do something that A, could have been done a lot better, or B, he should have avoided doing it at all if he wanted to carry on killing. The killing was running out of control. If you see the pattern of his killing, it's getting more and more and more. And we know with any kind of addiction, it builds up and your tolerance builds up. So in the end, I think he probably realised he was either going to be caught or something had to stop him. And the rest of his life was probably a little bit out of control with his family life. So pressure was building on him. And my personal theory is that subconsciously, he probably would not have said so, but subconsciously he wanted to be stopped.
He really wasn't very good at covering his tracks, was he? The badly forged will. But he also claimed that his victim in this case was a heroin addict.
Yes.
And he produced for the police computerised medical notes to demonstrate that, but the police were able to show that those notes had been written after the woman had died.
Yeah. He had an interesting part of his psyche, which probably goes back to his mother, was that he thought he was brilliant. He thought he was very, very clever. He was very arrogant, particularly with people he regarded as beneath him. And he was not a very pleasant character to other doctors or to people who worked for him. And he absolutely thought that he knew about computers. Computers were relatively new. We didn't all have them in our homes at that stage. This is when computers are in a sort of embryonic stage. And it just so happened that Greater Manchester Police, they now all have specialists, of course, in computers and computer fraud. But at that time, there were no such things. But there was a man on the staff of Greater Manchester Police who understood computers. And when he went into Shipman's surgeries, Shipman was very arrogant with him, spoke down to him, spoke to him as though he was a sort of moron who wouldn't understand a computer. But in fact, he did. He understood a computer very well, and he was able to prove that the notes that suggested that Kathleen Grundy was a heroin addict had been added later. And he had done that with other victims as well. He'd gone back and written in heart conditions and things which they didn't have. And he had particularly done this when the chips were down. If he thought she was going to be found, her body found with morphine in it, then he would cover it by suggesting she was a heroin addict, which actually made people laugh out loud. The idea of the very respectable Mrs. Grundy going down Moss Side in Manchester to score heroin was just like nothing anybody could ever believe.
So armed now with evidence of murder and forgery, Greater Manchester Police arrested Shipman on September the 7th, 1998. At first, I think he was charged just with Kathleen Grundy's murder and the forgery of her will. But detectives started to question, didn't they, Jean, how many other deaths were perhaps not as they seemed?
Yes, they started looking at his list and they had a checklist of 5 things. And one of them was very important, was the body buried or cremated? Because if it was cremated, they would not be able to find the morphine in the body. So if a body had been buried and if the victim had been not expected to die, that was another part of their checklist. And if Shipman had been seen either at the scene of the crime or had visited just earlier that day. And they came up with a checklist of 5 things, and they just started initially investigating those that scored 5. Subsequently, it went down to investigating right down to the 3s, but they found the list of 15 people, 14 as well as Mrs. Grundy, that they eventually exhumed and charged him with.
Our podcast, True Criminals, is almost a year old. Thank you to all those on Patreon and to our listeners who followed us over the year and heard stories that have ranged from serial killers like Fred West and Myra Hindley to ongoing mysteries like the disappearance of Madeleine McCann and Lord Lucan, to robbers including Playboy thief Valerio Vice and Great Train mastermind Bruce Reynolds. As a Christmas special, we want to answer your questions about our previous episodes. Ask us anything you want, and Martin and I will try to answer. Send us your thoughts to contact@audiobleachglobal.com.
They ultimately homed in on a number of specific cases. They didn't use all of the suspected murders in the trial, but they just used a few that they felt they could prove in court beyond a reasonable doubt. And police and prosecutors often do this, don't they? Because they don't want to overload juries and end up with a trial that goes on for months and months and months. So I think there were 15 murder charges when it came to trial.
15 murder charges and 1 forgery charge, yes.
And in October 1999, just over a year after his arrest, that's when the case actually went to trial at Preston Crown Court. Shipman pleaded not guilty, so I'm guessing that trial was long and complex. What evidence did the prosecution present, Jean? What was the thrust of their case?
Well, the prosecution, of course, had the family witnesses. They had the amazing toxicology that these bodies were found with a large amount of morphine in them, which in itself was probably enough to convict him. They had the families, the people who had been surprised by his death, the neighbours who'd seen her that morning and she was chatting away quite well and then really shocked to find that she'd died that afternoon. So they had a lot of evidence for the prosecution. But Shipman still had a great many supporters and defenders, particularly amongst his patients. And he wrote copious letters from Strangeways Prison to lots of people. And he was saying to all of them, just wait till the defence starts. And I think all the press and everybody else, and me, I was there, I was waiting for the defence to start. And the defence started, and there was no defence. It just fell away immediately. They couldn't challenge the toxicology. They tried to. His barrister, who was landed with a poison chalice from the Medical Defence Union, she did her best. But there was very little she could do in the face of that overwhelming evidence. And it collapsed completely, very quickly. So the trial was actually shorter than we had all thought it was going to be, yes.
I didn't cover the trial like you, Jean. I wished I had. But it must have been fascinating to see and hear Shipman for the first time. What was he like in court?
I wasn't there every day, but it was the first time I'd seen him, whereas Brian Whittle, my co-writer, had seen him outside the surgery before he was arrested, when he used to give press conferences quite cheerfully. I was particularly fascinated by his wife Primrose, and I did manage to have a very small chat with her, but she never says anything outside, I think he's innocent. And she continued to say that all the way through the Shipman inquiry. So, yeah, that would have been, for me, really, really interesting to find out what she knew and felt about what had been happening to him during those years.
But what was he like in court?
He was his usual arrogant self. He was very arrogant. In police questioning, he used to just turn his back on the police, swivel the chair round and sit there with his back facing the police who were interrogating him. He sat in court impassively. He didn't look at his family. He's small, so he seemed quite insubstantial next to the security men who came to court with him. And he had that smug look on his face that was typical Shipman and was always there, really. I'm cleverer than you, I'm better than you, until he wasn't.
It makes you wonder, Jean, doesn't it? You're talking about his wife, Primrose. What was going through her mind when she sat in that courtroom and she heard the prosecution and she heard what sounds like overwhelming evidence?
Yeah, she still continued to maintain his innocence. The dynamics of that relationship are quite interesting. She was 17 when he met her and she had just left school. He was the grammar school boy. He was clever. He was a medical student in Leeds. She was the local girl from Wetherby who'd left school with no qualifications and was just starting work as a window dresser at a store. And they met on the bus travelling into Leeds in the morning. And very quickly she was pregnant. So he went through medical school, married. It was a very small, quiet shotgun wedding, just the two fathers present. She was there with a baby alongside him, and he was struggling on a small grant. It must have been quite difficult for them. But she was absolutely dedicated to him then and throughout the rest of her life, despite her parents who lost contact with her. Amazingly, her parents, who were a typical working-class couple, mostly you would think they would be quite pleased that their daughter was marrying a doctor, but they sussed him out very quickly. And when he was charged with the drug addiction, Primrose and the first two children were forced to move back in with them, and they have no tolerance of him at all. And when he came out from that and started work again, all family communication with Primrose's family ended completely. So it's a funny relationship. The dynamic was obviously he was the clever one, she was subservient. Later on, she was quite tough and strong herself, but she always felt subservient to him.
And nobody was surprised at the guilty verdicts and the sentence. Remind us, Jean, what happened at the end of the trial.
Well, of course, he was found guilty on all counts, all 15 counts of murder and the charge of forgery, and he was sentenced to life imprisonment. And unusually, the judge said, it usually happens later on, but the judge said that in his opinion, he should never, ever be released from prison. So a normal life sentence, you can get out after some time, especially if you confront your crimes and express some sort of remorse, you can actually be released. But the judge said in his case, he should never, ever be released.
And it's interesting to learn that it was 11 days after the conviction that he was finally struck off the medical register.
Yes, the minute they even had suspicions about him, the police tried to get him struck off. They contacted the GMC and said, we don't think he should be practicing. But before they actually arrested him, he carried on having surgeries and talking to his patients about the fact the police were investigating him quite arrogantly. And it seemed ridiculous. And the police weren't too worried because they felt that in view of the fact they were investigating quite heavily, he probably wouldn't be killing people. But it was still a risk to take, and the GMC just didn't strike him off. It was harder than they thought to get him struck off.
The thing I always remember about the end of the trial, Jean, I don't know whether you were there on the last day, but a verdict came late on a Friday afternoon when everybody really, the journalists, the camera crews, were packing up, thinking that this was a jury deliberation that was going to go on to the next week. And if you weren't heading to the pub already, that was really in most people's minds. And then suddenly, very late on the afternoon, you were all summoned back into court for verdicts.
Absolutely. Although it felt like an open and shut case in terms of the evidence, at the same time, there are actually 16 charges and the jury has to consider each charge individually and properly. That's their job. And that was explained to them by the judge. You must consider each individual case. So there was a lot of evidence for them to consider. So everybody was assured that they would be in a hotel for the weekend and everybody would resume the following week. And suddenly they had decided unanimously that it was guilty on all counts and they came back into court and that was it.
Shipman was punished, wasn't he, for 15, I suppose you could describe them as slam dunk cases because the evidence was so strong, which prosecutors knew that they could prove. But detectives suspected Shipman had actually killed dozens, even hundreds of patients over the years. And I suppose the question that haunts everybody who hears about this case is why? Why would a successful family man with seemingly so much to lose coldly murder his patients, the people who trusted him?
It's a really fascinating one. I talked to a lot of forensic psychologists after this case, and I talked to a lot of experts, including Gwen Adshead at Broadmoor and other people. This man had a strange relationship with morphine, but he also had a strange grandiosity, I think is the correct word. He thought he was above other people. One of the reasons why he didn't want to stay in a group practice or a practice with other doctors was because he wasn't the linchpin, the top dog. He would assert his superiority in rather pathetic ways, like absolutely humiliating people he thought were under him. There was a young woman who came to try and sell new drugs to the surgery, and it was her first day, and he reduced her to tears. He just went for her like mad. And when he went for those revision sessions that doctors are compelled to go to, all the other doctors in the area would try to make sure they were not on the same ones as Fred Shipman, because he would always stand up and they'd be having a lecture from some professor on a particular thing, maybe kidney disease or something, and he would have researched it and he would stand up and ask question after question after question, trying to prove he was cleverer than the professor in front of the crowd. It was a need to be superior. And he exercised that need over Primrose, over his children, and they were easy meat. But he moved to his own surgery just to exercise it over the menial staff. And he could be horrible to the menial staff, but also he could be very charming. Some of the receptionists swore by him. He needed to feel he was superior. He had a smug little smile and he needed to talk down to people. This is, I think, embedded in the fact his mother made him feel superior. And then he came up against the fact that in the sixth form at school, he was not the king of the kids. He was not the most academic. He had to work very hard to get where he got. He had to work very hard at Leeds Medical School. But actually in medical school, working hard is a good characteristic. So he did all right, but he wasn't by any means a high flyer. but he wanted to be. His favourite expression was, "I am the doctor. I'm the one that knows. Don't you dare ever challenge me. I'm the doctor." And that's why, in a way, choosing, on the whole, elderly working class people in Hyde made them easy meat for him, because that generation felt doctors were superior. I think back to my own mother, the doctor said that was okay. And he had that power then. So power was a very big part of it. He may or may not have been on the spectrum. He certainly had some sort of compulsive thing. So there's an amalgam of different traits feeding into this very complex character. But I think in the end of it, it's the grandiosity, the need to be God. And doctors can be God. It's one of the few professions where you can actually play God quite successfully. And that's what he wanted. He really wanted that. And inextricably with that was the relationship with morphine.
After the trial, there was the Shipman inquiry, and the High Court judge, Dame Janet Smith, studied his personality in depth, and even she admitted that she wasn't really able to shed much light on his motive, even after her 2-year investigation. She suggested that he was addicted to killing, he had an addictive personality, and that perhaps the act of killing became a craving. Do you think she got it right or got near the truth?
I think he had a constellation of personality disorders, perhaps. But I think the addiction part, he was addictive. He got addicted to pethidine. That's a physical addiction. But his other addiction was this addiction to killing. And I think he needed to do more and more to get the satisfaction from it. It was carefully examined to find out whether there was any sexual motivation. And it was dismissed. There never seemed to be, in any case, any sexual motivation in the killing. Theft, he did steal from his victims. We know that. He stole bits of jewellery and he stole bits of money that was lying around. But to be honest, if you were looking for a career as a thief, you wouldn't choose that demographic, because most of his patients, not all, but most, did not have very much anyway.
We've talked about killers retaining trophies from their victims in previous episodes, particularly when we talked about Fred West. His trophies were rather more gruesome. He kept fingers and toes.
Yes.
Shipman's mementos, if you like, were rather more mundane. One report suggested that he kept a pet budgerigar that he wanted to give to his aunt. It all sounds rather bizarre.
Yeah. There was no real financial motivation in it, but on the whole, they were just little things, trivia, little bits. There was a whole box full of jewellery found in the garage. But after the trial, only one valuable ring was ever returned to a family member, because it's very difficult to prove. They had to prove. They had to have a photograph of Auntie or Granny wearing that particular thing to get it back. So very little went back. And Primrose asked if she could have it back, but they said no, and it was all auctioned, and the money went to the Victim Support Organisation, which had helped with the trial all the way through, looking after the witnesses.
The word psychopath is often used, rightly or wrongly, to describe seemingly cold-blooded killers. Jean, do you think Shipman had psychopathic traits?
I would say he does have psychopathic traits, but he defies the normal definition of a psychopath. He sustained a long, and apparently a normal relationship with Primrose for many years. And it was probably disintegrating towards the end, along with everything else. He had 4 children, and he sustained some sort of relationship with them all the way through. He could be quite a harsh father. He did have some social contacts. He had the odd friend or two. He joined clubs. If he joined a club or an organisation, he generally had a brief and intense relationship with them and then pulled out again. These things are not normal for psychopaths. Psychopathy involves really an abnegation of emotion, and he did seem to be able to feel some emotion. But at times of the murders, he became very callous. He said very callous things to the families of individuals involved, victims in the family. He could be quite callous. He could say, "Oh, she's gone," and he would not make any attempt to revive her. And so, yeah, psychopathic tendencies, yes, but he defies all the normal definitions of a serial killer.
It's terrifying to think, Jean, that he hid really in plain sight and abused his trust so heavily. We touched on his wife Primrose refusing to believe he was guilty. They had 4 children too. What happened to the children in all of this?
Well, I never made too many inquiries because I always felt that the children saw them in court. I really felt that they were innocent. They were innocent in this. And do we have the right to ascribe the sins of the fathers to the children? I don't think we do. They have all gone on to lead, I think, quite successful and normal lives, as far as we know. But some newspapers have tracked them down a bit and tracked Primrose down as well. I think Primrose would be a really, really interesting person to talk to, but I rather think the children were very, very innocent victims in this.
Have you ever spoken to Primrose after the court case, Jean, over the years?
No, I only spoke to her during the court case. We had an amicable discussion in the ladies' loo about other things to do with the mirror on the wall being too high and obviously put there by a man, ha. And then when I said to her, would you really like to talk to me about this properly? She just clammed up and walked away. And she did that to all journalists. She turned her back on all journalists. She was friendly. She smiled and said hello in court to journalists, but she would not talk to anybody.
She certainly managed to resist responding to the several letters that I wrote to her over the years.
Yes.
And I think that's the treatment that everybody else got.
Yes. Yeah, she got quite a few letters and she rejected them all, ignored them all. And she was to some extent hounded because immediately afterwards she had to leave their home because obviously people were refusing to serve her in the shops and people were abusive in the street. And she had to move on several times until she found the place where she now lives and has lived for some time, more or less in isolation.
Jean, thank you for helping us lay out the facts of this awful, unique and bizarre case.
Martin, I think what makes the Shipman case so frightening is it defies reason. How do you guard against a killer with no clear motive? As Jean said, he'd have been a good doctor if he hadn't killed his patients. Shipman wasn't insane in the legal sense. He knew exactly what he was doing. He was deliberate, methodical, and for a long, long time unstoppable.
He never argued insanity, but that's simply because he said he didn't kill them. Yes, unstopped for 20 years. What he did was completely at odds with the image of a genial GP who was adored by many of his patients, with possibly hundreds of victims. But as horrifying as Shipman's story is, it's important to remember how rare it is as well. He was an aberration, a once-in-a-lifetime monster in a white coat. In fact, he remains the only British doctor ever convicted of murdering patients. I know we've had nurse killers since, but no doctors. A grim distinction that hopefully no one else will ever earn.
Interesting, isn't it? We talk about him killing over around 2 decades in terms of the span of his killing spree, but there are some suggestions that he may have killed as an intern, so I don't think we'll ever know really the full extent.
No, we won't. It's certainly 250, but it may be more than 300, and the further back the authorities go to try and investigate suspected murders, the more difficult it is because the records aren't there, the witnesses aren't there. Very, very difficult to prosecute a case with a real lack of evidence.
It didn't end with just locking him up. The shock of Shipman's crimes forced a lot of soul-searching in the medical community and changes in how doctors are monitored. We're going to get into those in episode 2, and we'll also discuss what happened after the trial, Shipman's life in prison, his dramatic demise, and the major reforms in healthcare which were introduced to prevent anything like this from happening again. Join us then. Welcome to our new Patreon followers. Thank you for joining. Just to remind listeners, if you want to hear the episodes ad-free, you can. Head over to patreon.com/True Criminals. Stay with us for 3 months at Patreon and we'll send you a free True Criminals mug. Martin and I haven't even got one of those yet. Your support means everything to us. If you're enjoying the podcast, please take a moment to leave us a review. It helps us grow, reach new listeners, and keep bringing you the stories you love. This episode is brought to you by Audio Bleach Global. Our producer is Russell Barnes, with audio production by Andrew Chappell. The original score was composed by Chap Mannequin, artwork by Bleached, executive produced by Lee Mann. Follow True Criminals on Instagram at true.criminals and on YouTube at youtube.com/@true-criminals. For exclusive content and ways to support the show, visit us at patreon.com/True Criminals. For partnership opportunities, please contact us at contact@audiobleachglobal.com.